All right, class, welcome back. We are going to continue with Unit 1. Whether or not I'll be able to finish it all in one video, I'm not sure yet. There's quite a bit left, but we'll just keep it moving and see how we go. The next topic to come up after we left off is what's going on in the Islamic world. And bear with me 1 minute. I need to refresh this PowerPoint. So where we left off, the last unit was mostly we just covered the Renaissance. There was a lot there. And next topic up is what's going on in the Islamic world. A lot of this is still relevant to things you might see today in the Middle East, for example, if you're interested at all in that part of the world. So the first thing that is pointed out in the textbook is that there are Islam is one religion. There are over 1 billion Muslims on earth today, but like with any religion, there are certain divisions within the religion. So if you're familiar with Christianity, for example, under that term Christian, well, yes, it's one thing, but also, are you Catholic or are you Protestant? And if you're Protestant, well, that could mean any number of things. Are you a Methodist, a Baptist, an Episcopalian? A lot of different divisions. If you're Jewish, are you Reform? Are you Orthodox, etc.? Similar thing with Islam. The major division within Islam is Sunni and Shia. And what you see on the image here is a map of most of the Islamic world, not all of it, but most of it. And for well over 1,000 years, there has been a division within that religion. And the major division is Sunni versus Shia. This is a division that goes all the way back to the very first days of the religion. It basically, there was a dispute after the Prophet Muhammad died over who should be the next leader of the Muslims. It goes back all the way to the beginning. So what we see on this map here is right around the time, let's say, of Columbus, which we'll get to soon. The Islamic world was far more advanced than Europe in terms of technology, security, economy, the sciences, architecture. They were much more advanced, but there were divisions. You see here, this is roughly, let's say, 500 years ago. There were 3 major Islamic empires. And in the middle, in that perfect color there, the Safavid Empire, that is mostly what is today Iran. It used to be called Persia, but I'm sure you've heard of Iran. Not a friend of the United States, the current Iranian government. Iran today, and back then it was called the Safavid Empire, but in the center of the map here is a Shia Muslim nation, a Shia Muslim civilization. Most other Muslims are Sunni Muslims. And those two groups, to put it lightly, do not always get along very well. That was true 1,000 years ago. It's still true today. So if you're familiar with anything going on in the Middle East today, if you look at this map, again, that area in purple, that is basically the modern nation of Iran. But if we look at other areas of the Islamic world, yeah, they're all Muslim, but there's this Sunni-Shia divide. So during this period, hundreds of years ago, these empires, even though they're all Muslims, technically, they may be conflict between them based on, are you Sunni or are you Shia? Today, again, Iran is the major Shia Muslim power in the world. And other Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia, for example, I'm sure you've all heard of Saudi Arabia. Today, modern Saudi Arabia would have been part of the Ottoman Empire back then. There is division. So today, in this Sunni-Shia split, just like back then, the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire may have fought over this division, Sunni-Shia. Today, Iran, a Shia nation, and Saudi Arabia, for example, a Sunni nation, they're not friends. They are rivals. They are enemies, maybe, might not be too strong of a word. And so very common throughout all human history within religion, we all know there's violence between religions. What is actually more common is violence within the same religion. And that's been true in the Islamic world for a very long time. I'm going to show you a quick video clip here to illustrate how this divide is still at play all these centuries later. Execution of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the Sunni Muslim dictator of Iraq until the American invasion 20 years ago, and he was overthrown and ultimately executed. So you're going to see here a video of the execution of Saddam Hussein. Few things before I show you this. Number one, the quality is not good. This was filmed, this is probably 17 or 18 years ago now. It was filmed with, by your standards, a very primitive phone. This is before smartphones, so this is would have been probably like a Nokia flip phone that's filming this. So the quality is not very good. And the person filming it was not supposed to be filming it. He was kind of doing it on the down low. It wasn't like an official thing that there wasn't an official cameraman there. They were not supposed to film this. And it was a really bad idea to film it, frankly, for reasons I'll explain afterwards. What you'll see is Saddam Hussein being led up to be hung. Pretty obvious, noose around his neck. And there's back and forth between Saddam Hussein and his executioners. He is a Sunni Muslim. His executioners are Shia Muslims. All right. So we'll watch this. It's only about maybe 2 minutes long. Pay attention to the subtitles. All right. Because they say a lot about how this divide is still very much at work in that part of the world. All right, let me check. Audio was back. Okay. So a couple things that I hope you may have noticed there. Um, he's being led to his death. He starts reciting a prayer, and if you notice the subtitles, they make it clear he's reciting a Sunni version of the prayer, and his executioners start speaking over him, reciting the Shia version of the prayer. So more than 1,000 years after this split between Sunni Muslim and Shia Muslims, 1,300 years later, these people in the last minute of this guy's life are still arguing over the correct version of the prayer. So that tells you something about this divide. People take it very seriously, to put it lightly. If you heard on the subtitle, one of the executioners starts chanting Muqtada, Muqtada, Muqtada. That's the name of a guy, Muqtada al-Sadr. He was a Shia Muslim leader. And so what that was about was he's taunting Saddam Hussein, the Sunni, who's about to die, chanting Muqtada, Muqtada, the name of a Shia Muslim leader. He's taunting him, saying, hey, we're in charge now. The Shia now are in charge, and you, Sunni, you're about to die. I mentioned that it was probably a really bad idea to film this. And if you noticed, look, this guy's about to be killed. I don't know about you. I'd be probably scared, nervous, all the above. He clearly is not scared. He's not nervous. He's not begging for his life. He's not crying, please don't do this. He is completely stoic, calm, brave. They start mocking him, and he responds kind of sneeringly, "You call yourselves men?" Like he has total contempt for them. He's not afraid at all. Um, Saddam Hussein, the guy who was killed there, was a monster. He is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. He was an absolute butcher. And if you don't know anything about him and all you know is that video, he comes across as a martyr. He comes across as brave. He comes across, to put it bluntly, as kind of a badass, staring death in the face with just iron will and no trace of fear. So not a good look to somehow figure out a way to make that monster seem sympathetic. But just one anecdote about how serious that divide within the Islamic world still is, okay? If you're familiar, for example, with the civil war in Syria, a lot of that violence is ultimately about that Sunni versus Shia split. Things forbidden in Islam. All religions have things that are forbidden, that are taboo, certain types of food, certain sexual behavior, um, any number of things. And that's not unique to Islam, but there is one thing about Islam that is much different from the way most other religions are practiced by most other people. So here's an anecdotal example that I'll walk you through. Things forbidden by Islam: gambling, alcohol, pork, usury, lending money at interest. Okay. For any religion, you could find a list of things that the religion technically forbids. That's not unique. Here's what you should consider, though. The seriousness to which the average Muslim takes the rules of their religion is very different than the seriousness with which the average Christian, let's say, might take the rules, generally speaking. So here's an example. The map here and the color coding, you can see the key down there with what colors indicate what. This is about alcohol consumption, okay? Purple is the highest consumption, green is the lowest. All right. What does this tell you? Well, Europeans and Russians, they drink a lot. Okay, well, so what? Who drinks the least? That's the green. Now, if you were to take a map of the world, just like this one, and instead of measuring alcohol consumption, you were to say, take this map of the world and color in green every Muslim majority country, and you were to lay that map over this one, it's almost precisely the exact same map. In other words, there is almost an exact correlation between the countries in the world that consume the least amount of alcohol and the countries in the world that are Muslim majority. It's an almost one-for-one identical correlation, okay? If you look at all those countries in green across all of Northern Africa, those are all Muslim majority countries. All across the Middle East, all Muslim majority countries. Right down to Indonesia, right above Australia, that's a Muslim majority country. That whole arc of green across Northern Africa, the Middle East, down to Oceania, those are all Muslim majority countries. The only major exception that you see in that whole arc that's not green, that's light blue, is India. India is not a Muslim majority country. It's Hindu majority, and Hindus are not forbidden from drinking alcohol. That's the only exception. And that makes sense, right? That's the outlier, and that just so happens to be the only major country in that arc that isn't Muslim majority country. So what? What does this tell you? It tells you that generally speaking, you understand I'm generalizing because we're talking about billions of people. Generally speaking, the average Muslim takes the rules of their religion much more strictly and literally than the average follower of other religions, generally speaking. Okay. It's a really important thing for you to understand about how different religions operate differently. Let me give you a quick example, a counter example. The Catholic Church, there's nearly 1 billion Catholics in the world. The Catholic Church forbids Catholics from using birth control. Do you think the average Catholic in the United States does not use birth control? Because the religion forbids it, but and the polling is pretty clear on this. You can look at polls of American Catholics. Do you use birth control? And the huge majority of American Catholics like, yeah, we use birth control. We know it's technically not allowed, but I mean, come on, yeah, right? Other followers of other religions can kind of compartmentalize and say, yes, I understand this is a rule, but it's not fundamental to our faith. And let's be realistic, you know, we might not follow every rule right down to the letter. Generally speaking, you don't find that in Islamic countries. They're much more literal, much more direct, much more likely to follow the rules of the religion with a seriousness that is not often seen among many Christians, as a counterexample. Here is another example of how things change over time and how any civilization at any given time might be associated with certain behavior. And then if you flash forward 1,000 years, it might be totally flipped. 1,000 years ago, Muslim women had more property rights than Western women enjoyed until the 1800s. So let's just dumb this down. 1,000 years ago, women in Muslim countries had more rights than women in Christian countries. Today, you probably understand this is completely reversed. Today, women in Christian majority countries have far more rights than women in Muslim majority countries. There was a news story a couple of years ago. I just mentioned Saudi Arabia. A couple of years ago, Saudi Arabia passed a law allowing, for the first time, allowing women to drive. And it was like a big deal. Wow, Saudi Arabia, they're letting women drive. You understand, in most Muslim countries, women, in many of them, they're not allowed to go to school. They have very few legal rights or property rights, very few rights within the marriage or the family. Women in Western countries have way more rights than women in Islamic countries. However, if you look at this fact here, 1,000 years ago, it was totally flipped. What does that tell you? Nothing is set in stone. These things evolve over time. Let me give you another example that's similar to this one here. 1,000 years ago, Jews would have been much safer living in Muslim countries than Christian countries. Today, just like the issue with women, it is completely reversed. Today, if you're Jewish, in most Muslim countries, you're not even going to be allowed to live in the country as a Jew. And even if you're technically allowed, you're going to be in danger. These things evolve, okay? Nothing is cast in stone. Any civilization, any religion is capable of any type of behavior, good, bad, or indifferent. This is just another example of that. To understand the cultural differences today between Islamic countries and non-Islamic countries, this is a really good cartoon. You have two women here. One is almost entirely naked. The other is as covered as you can possibly be. So, right, so they're opposites. And they're both having the same thought about each other. Each woman looks at the other and thinks that the other one is being oppressed. And this is really important for you to think about. If you look at this image and I were to ask you, which woman do you think is oppressed? Most of you would probably say, well, the Islamic woman's being oppressed. And you're probably assuming that she's forced to dress with her entire body covered. And depending on the country, that may be true, but we don't know that. You can say as a counterexample, in the United States, there are no laws forcing women to dress certain ways, right? And I don't know if you know any Muslim women in the United States, but Muslim women in the US are free to dress however they want, but they tend to generally dress much more conservatively than non-Muslim women. So that would tell you that at least part of the reason they dress more conservatively is culture rather than force. Now, what's the rationale here? The Western woman in the bikini is thinking the other woman's being oppressed. She's assuming she's forced to cover up by men and power, and that could very well be true. The the other point of view is something you maybe not have been exposed to, so I think that's more important for me to walk you through. Why would the Muslim woman in this cartoon think the Western woman is being oppressed? Well, here's their view on this issue, okay? The way women in the West, in the United States, let's say, are portrayed in culture, in media, in movies, in music videos, on TV, the Islamic critique of that is that in the US, for example, women are objectified and are treated and portrayed as objects for the sexual gratification of men. All right, I'm going to walk you through their critique, and you can say that's crazy, that's ridiculous, or maybe there's some truth to that, whatever it is. I just want you to understand the point of view of Muslims generally looking at our culture. They look at how women are portrayed in our culture. Again, music videos, TV, video games, etc. And by women, I mean up to and including, teenage girls. And they say that the Americans sexualize and objectify women, and that is degrading towards women. Covering up a woman and, a woman dressing conservatively, that's not degrading. That's protecting the dignity of the woman by not portraying the woman as a sexual object. What message does it send to men if a woman is walking down the street 80% naked? This is the Islamic critique. The message that's sending to men and to society at large is that women are primarily objects for the sexual gratification of men. And is that not degrading towards women? That's their view, okay? And by having a value structure in which women dress much more conservatively, it removes that element of objectification, of looking at the woman as a object for the gratification of men. Okay, if that makes any sense to you. So there are major differences between Islamic civilization and Western civilization on any number of things, but this is a big cultural one that's important for you to understand. It's a big divide, okay? The critique is that when women are portrayed, especially young women, are portrayed as sexual objects, that's degrading towards women. It is destabilizing to society. If a relationship, for example, between a man and a woman is based on how good the woman looks naked when she's 20 years old, that's not a strong foundation for a relationship because you know what? Life happens, people get old and fat. And if your relationship is based on how good you look when you're naked and you're 20, that's not a strong foundation because that's going to fade away. All right, that's their critique. You could take it or leave it. Let me give you one more quick example that you might be familiar with. A couple of years ago, this is an extreme example, but it's important for you to think about. A couple of years ago, the song of the year at the VMAs, I want to say, Video Music Awards, one of those things. I don't watch any of that garbage, but I heard about it. Song of the year was WAP, W-A-P. I'm not going to tell you what that stands for because I don't want to lose my job. It does not stand for War and Peace. Cardi B, I want to say, and Megan Thee Stallion. Haven't heard the song, don't want to hear it, haven't seen the video, don't want to see it, but I know enough to know that type of culture, if that's the word for it, is profoundly offensive and disgusting in the eyes of the majority of the rest of the planet. okay, including Muslims, right? Whatever Megan Thee Stallion is doing, God bless her. I wish her well. But mm, I have a 7-year-old daughter. You think I'm going to let my daughter listen to Megan Thee Stallion? I don't think so. So cultures are different. We'll go through lots of examples of these later in the course. And cultural values in terms of the treatment of women, the treatment of religious minorities, et cetera, those things evolve and change over time. Last major point about the Islamic world, and then we'll start leading up to Columbus, is how they treat the issue of religion and government. Now, in the West, over time, it's taken a very long time, but for the last roughly 200 years, most Western countries have evolved to the position that religion and government should be separate from each other, and that combining religion with government causes division, violence, persecution. If, let's say, in the American context, for example, if the president is Catholic and tries to enforce Catholic religious beliefs on people who are not Catholic, that could rip the country apart, and therefore we should separate personal religious beliefs from the job of the government, right? Separation of church and state, etc. In Islamic countries, that's not how it goes. That is not considered a good thing. I talked about Iran earlier. The bottom here, the Ayatollah Khomeini he's dead now, but he was the leader of the Iranian Revolution 40 years ago or so. And this is his quote on the relationship between Islam and government. When anyone studies a little or pays a little attention to the rules of Islamic government, Islamic politics, society, Islamic economy, he will realize, here's the key, Islam is a very political religion. Anyone who says that religion is separate from politics is a fool. He does not know Islam or politics. Anyone who says that religion is separate from politics is a fool. Okay, he's being very direct, very honest, very blunt. And most Muslims, again, I'm generalizing, we're talking about 1 billion people, but the majority of Muslims would agree with this. And here's their view, and you should think about the pros and cons of this. And I don't know if you're religious, that's none of my business, but if you are, you might be able to understand this. And even if you're not, use your imagination. For devoutly religious people, their religious faith is the central aspect of their identity. Okay? And full disclosure, just for an example, and I've told you last time, I'll say it again, my opinions shouldn't matter to you at all, but just to walk you through an example of how these ideas get plugged into real life. I am a devoutly religious person. My faith is literally the first thing I think about before my feet hit the floor in the morning. Okay. It's not something that I do once a week. It's not something that I can separate from my personal behavior. It's very serious. Okay. And a lot of religious people of all religions feel that way. And so what the Islamic view says is religious faith is very serious. It's not some trivial, casual thing that you can compartmentalize and put over here in its own box. Okay? So what they would say is a law, a law passed by a government that goes against a religious law is illegitimate. You can't have that contradiction. Whereas in the United States, for example, the huge majority of Americans, including very religious people, have agreed over time, yeah, you know what? I might have a deeply held religious belief, but the government shouldn't enforce that on everybody else because not everybody else agrees with my religious beliefs. So two very different ways of approaching this issue. Should religion and government be separated? Western countries say yes, that's good. Islamic countries generally say no, that's not good, that's hypocritical. So very, very different worldviews. Now, leading up to Columbus, this is a map from approximately 100 years ago. So let's say 400 years after Columbus. It's a map of the Eastern Hemisphere, and you can see all the countries that are colored in were conquered by Europeans. So Africa is the biggest example here. You can look at Africa, and basically the entire continent was conquered by Europeans 100 years ago. Most of South Asia, Oceania, et cetera, et cetera. How did that happen? How did Europeans get to the point, and the peak, again, was about 100 years ago. 100 years ago, Europeans controlled about 2/3 of the entire planet. How could that happen? Didn't happen overnight. It's a very slow process. And in retrospect, we can say it kind of started with Columbus. So let's go back to the beginning and trace how the Europeans got so dominant. Because, again, at Columbus's time, Islamic civilization was way more advanced than European civilization, and the Chinese were as well. The West was not the dominant player before Columbus. Europe was, again, economically, uh, politically, technologically, way behind the Muslims and the Chinese. But things change. So the West was not the dominant player before Columbus. His voyages derived from a desire to share in and control the wealth coming in from the Indian Ocean. Okay, so Indian Ocean, if you can orient yourself on the map, right south of India. The most advanced civilizations on Earth were the Islamic civilization and the Chinese civilization. India and the Indian Ocean is kind of the bridge between that connects the Islamic world with the Chinese worlds. Okay. So the Indian Ocean, where Islamic and Chinese civilization meet, that's where the action is. That's where the best trade is. That's where the best technology is, because that's where the two most advanced civilizations, the Chinese and the Muslims, that's where they intersect in the Indian Ocean. So if you want, and this is what the Europeans wanted, they wanted access to the best stuff in the world, the best technology, etc. That means they need to go to the Indian Ocean to get it. And they want to figure out a way to get there directly, cutting out the middleman. Then and now, this is a timeless reality of economics and of cost. If you want a product, the fewer middlemen there are involved in handling that product before you get it, the cheaper the product will be. The more people that handle a product and that are involved in the shipping, etc., by the time it gets to you, the more middlemen there are, all those middlemen have to get paid. And that means the more middlemen there are, by the time it gets to you, the cost is going to go up and up and up and up. So how do you get things cheap? You, as near as you can, you go directly to the source, cutting out the middlemen, and you buy in bulk. That's how you cut the price. So the Europeans want technology coming out of China, let's say. So they're thinking, how do we get directly to that market rather than paying people to ship it to us, because that gets expensive? How do we cut out the middleman? That's the ambition of Columbus and others. China was the most advanced civilization in the world for centuries. I'm gonna jump ahead for one. Okay, for centuries, ending around 1700. So they were dominant before Columbus. They were dominant during Columbus. They were still dominant for 100, 200 years after Columbus. How did China lose its advantage? The upper image there on the right, Zheng He was a Chinese admiral. So pictured here, these are the types of ships that the Chinese were building during the time of Columbus. And they show you in that red circle, Columbus's ship, what he had to scale. And you can see that compared to Chinese technology, European technology was a joke. Columbus's ship was a joke compared to what the Chinese had at the same time. You could easily lift Columbus's ship out of the water, place it on the deck of that Chinese ship, and it wouldn't even take up a considerable amount of space. The Chinese ships were way more advanced. They were huge, as you can see. They could hold hundreds and hundreds of men. They could stay out on the open ocean for years. They could collect rainwater. They could grow food on the decks. They were amazing things. Now, if you were to go back to the time before Columbus and you were to predict who will, quote, discover the Americas, you wouldn't have guessed the Europeans. You would have guessed the Chinese. Look at the ships they have. You would have guessed that the Chinese with these ships would have eventually, quote, discovered the Americas. Probably, if you think about the geography, they probably would have discovered the west coast of the Americas, what is today California, Peru, and Southern America. But it didn't happen that way. So what happened? China lost its advantage. What did they do? Here's what they did. They were so advanced, and they knew it. They were so advanced that they decided that they had nothing to benefit by interacting with the rest of the world. And at the time, they were correct. They had all the best technology. They had the best ships. They had the best everything. There was nothing that the Europeans, for example, had that the Chinese wanted. Whatever the Europeans had was inferior. China has no interest in doing business with the Europeans. They have nothing that the Chinese wanted. So they were so much more advanced than the Europeans that the Chinese government decided to cut China off from interacting with the rest of the world for two reasons. Number one, the rest of the world has nothing that the Chinese wanted or needed. Number two, they got arrogant. They decided everyone was inferior to them, in that not only do the Europeans not have anything that the Chinese need, but the Europeans are so inferior that we don't even want to interact with them because that would just weaken us by interacting with inferior people. So we're just this is the Chinese perspective. We're going to cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. They're inferior. We're doing our own thing. We have nothing to be gained from interacting with them. We're going to isolate ourselves. To the point, and this is how seriously they took that decision, they destroyed all of these ships. They intentionally destroyed their ability to interact with other civilizations because they were so far advanced. So they destroyed these ships. What's the lesson? Well, they cut themselves off from competition. And when you do that, in business and sports, whatever it is, if you are the best and you then cut yourself off from competition, what will eventually happen is your competitors will catch up with you and will overtake you. And by the time you notice it, it's too late and you've lost your dominant position. That's what happened to China. They cut themselves off from the rest of the world. The Europeans ultimately caught up with where China was at technologically, economically, etc. And the Europeans then became more powerful than China. Now, today, you probably know that the Chinese economy is growing rapidly. They're not nearly as rich as many Americans think, but they're way better off than they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago. They're rebounding from this decision. This is the Chinese perspective on these events, okay? This is the Chinese worldview. We, the Chinese, were the dominant civilization in the world for a very long time. And that's true. We, the Chinese, made a mistake a few hundred years ago by cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world, and we lost our advantage. Also true. Now, what's going on in your lifetime with China? Now, this is their perspective. We, the Chinese, are reversing that mistake. We are no longer isolating ourselves. We are doing business all over the world with anyone. And we, the Chinese, will soon, this is what they want, regain our rightful and natural role as the dominant civilization in the world. It's important for you to understand this history, to understand what China's mentality is right now. They don't think in 5-minute intervals, okay? They think in 500-year intervals. This is the oldest civilization in the world by most measures. They've been around a long time. So their worldview again is we were dominant for a long time. We slipped up, made a mistake, had a rough couple 100 years. That's the blink of an eye in Chinese history. That's not a big deal. And now they're trying to reclaim what they consider to be their rightful spot as the dominant civilization in the world. That's what they want. And it's important as an American you understand that because they want to eat our lunch. They look at us as a joke. They look at the United States. Oh, the United States, what have they been around 250 years? Please, that's a joke. We've been here 5,000 years, right? So this history in the mind of the Chinese is not settled, all right? They want to reclaim the spot they had before Columbus as the most advanced civilization in the world. Slavery. We will get a little later in the course to the period during which slavery ended. I don't know what your prior knowledge is on this issue, so I want to make a few things very clear. When most Americans think about slavery, they think about American slavery as it was practiced in the United States, because that's our frame of reference. Fine. Please understand, slavery was universal. If I ask you the question, which civilizations practiced slavery? The answer basically is every single civilization on scale that we know of. All of them. Slavery is older than writing, okay? It is prehistorical. It's universal. Slavery was practiced everywhere for all time, everywhere forever. The Native Americans enslaved Native Americans, the Africans enslaved Africans, and on and on and on and on and on. There is nothing unique, unfortunately, about the fact that the United States practiced slavery. What is unique is that the United States ended slavery. So slavery is in the backdrop of all of human history, every civilization, everywhere forever, until relatively recently, until about 150 years ago. So before Columbus, slavery was practiced in Africa as everywhere else in the world. Arab and African merchants bought Europeans to West Africa as slaves. So who's enslaving who? Just like a lot of the other big topics that we've talked about and we will talk about moving forward, depends on when and where we're talking about. At some point, everyone was an enslaver, and at some point, everyone was enslaved. The Europeans enslaved people, sometimes they were enslaved themselves. The Africans enslaved people, sometimes they were enslaved themselves, and on and on and on. It's a constant in all of human history, unfortunately, until quite recently. So we'll get back to that, how slavery ended. We'll get back to that later in the course. Before Columbus, the Portuguese began the age of exploration. If you look at where Portugal is on this map, it's colored in green there at the western end of Europe. It would make sense just geographically, right? Geography, it does affect your culture. We talked about earlier. Portugal, the entire country is a coastline. They have direct access to the sea, so it makes sense that the Portuguese are going to be much better sailors and shipbuilders than the Germans, for example. Geography. So the Portuguese begin, and their strategy, again, they want to get to the Indian Ocean, to those markets. When you're looking at this map on the timeline we're at now, pretend that the Americas aren't on this map, because the Portuguese, like no one in Europe, Asia, or Africa knew the Americas existed. So in your mind's eye, erase the Americas from this map. They want to get to the Indian Ocean. How do they get there? By sailing south down the coast of Africa, and eventually underneath the entire African continent. Well, underneath, you know what I mean, around the southern tip, and then back up the east coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean, get what they need to get, sail all the way back. It's a long, dangerous, expensive process, but the Portuguese figured it out. All those little red dots up and down the coast of Africa, those represent places where the Portuguese would have stopped off on their way. If you're sailing from Portugal to India, for example, you're not just going to bang that out without stopping. That's physically impossible. You need to stop several times along the way to take on supplies, take on fresh water, make repairs to your ship, whatever it is. So all those spots up and down the coast of Africa represent areas on the coast where the Portuguese would stop off, make contact with the local African tribes. Hey, how's it going? We need some fresh water. What do you need? We got some guns. We got some, what do you want? Let's trade. They would take on whatever supplies they needed, food, water, whatever it is, and they would keep going. So what's important for you to understand is this is strictly business. The Portuguese are not trying to conquer any of these areas. They wouldn't have been physically capable of doing that. They're not trying to take over Africa. They're doing business. If they stop off, it's not to conquer, it's to do business. We have whatever it is, guns. What do you have? You got water, you got food. Here you go. Thank you. Have a nice day. We'll see you on the way back. Strictly business. And for that reason, the Portuguese were quite popular. Now, you probably know this, but thinking ahead, and we'll get to this pretty soon, other European empires, when the Spanish get involved, when the French get involved, when the English get involved, you know this, when they come to the Americas, they're not there to do business and then go off on their merry way. The Spanish, the English, the French, when they get into this process of exploration, they're trying to take and hold territory. And that, of course, is a much different thing. And they're going to be much less popular than the Portuguese for that reason. So ultimately, the Portuguese is a very slow process, but ultimately they're exploring the west coast of Africa, sailing further and further south, stopping off, making maps. How far south does the continent of Africa extend? They didn't know until they got to the Cape of Good Hope in, what does that say, 1488. So that's right before Columbus. It was 4 years before Columbus. By the time the Portuguese even figured out, is it possible to sail, underneath the entire continent of Africa, and then, back up the East Coast into the Indian Ocean. So the Portuguese figured out how to do this, but it is a very long, drawn out, expensive process. Columbus had the same motivation. Columbus also wanted to figure out a way to get to the Indian Ocean. And his vision, as you probably know, was different because he came up with the idea, yeah, I know I can sail south underneath the entire African continent, but that's going to take like a year and a half round trip. What if I sail west and get to the Indian Ocean that way? That was his revolutionary idea. This is a quote from a textbook I use in other courses. So now we're going to get to Columbus specifically. Rather than judge him by debates and standards of our time, it is more important to understand him in the context of his own time. So it's a couple things I want you to break down there. This comes up a lot. We'll go over other examples of this later in the course, but we'll talk about Columbus. Well, first I want you to look at this quote critically, because I don't know, this is very subtle, but I do this for a living and I notice things like this, and I want you to pick up on something. Rather than judge Columbus by debates and standards of our time, it's more important to understand him in the context of his own time. Columbus lived a long time ago, and when he lived, certain things, certain behavior was looked at as natural and normal that today we would reject, right? Slavery, for example. Slavery was universal. Columbus didn't object to slavery. He was involved in slavery to some degree. And by the standards of our time, that's awful, unacceptable behavior, right? But by the standard of his time, the context in which he was living in, everyone had been doing it forever, right? So it's an interesting debate to get into. When we're thinking about people in the past, do we judge them based on what we think is appropriate now? Or do we judge them based on, what the standards were at the time that they actually lived? Here's the thing about this quote, though. And this is very common in a lot of textbooks. This quote is telling you what to think. They're telling you what to think. They're saying it's more important to understand him in the context of his own time. All right, hey, you may agree with that. That's fine. That's great if you agree with that. That's not the point. The point is they're telling you what to think. If you only take one thing from this course, I want you to take a lot of things from this course, but if you have to pick one, this is a big one. You ready? Don't let people tell you what to think. Don't let the textbook do it like they're doing here. Don't let the media do it. Don't let me do it. Don't let people tell you what to think. No good. What this quote should say, in my opinion, is they should take the word it and is, they should flip them, and they should change that period at the end into a question mark. So now it would say, rather than judge Columbus by debates and standards of our time, is it more important to understand him in the context of his own time? Question mark. Now you're not being told what to think. You're being asked what you think. Very important distinction. So what do you think when we're assessing Columbus or anyone from the past? Do we judge him as if he's walking around right now in the 21st century in America, or do we judge them by what was going on at the time in the context that they lived? Very complicated question. Was this man, Columbus, incredibly brave, skilled, visionary, explorer, changed the world for all time? Uh, yeah, you got to be brave to sail off the end of the map. You got to be skilled to pull off what he pulled off. You have to be visionary to even come up with the idea. Did he change the world for all time? Yes. Objectively, yes. Does that mean he was a good person? Nope. Maybe he was a good person, but calling someone brave, skilled, and visionary and saying that someone changed the entire world for all time, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a good person. Adolf Hitler changed the world for all time. Not a good person, in my humble opinion. Or was Columbus a genocidal maniac, thief, and rapist? A lot of people say yes. Or could you be a combination of all these things? People are very complex. So let's spend a few minutes on this debate about Columbus. The last segment, I talked to you about bonfire of the vanities, destroying things that offend you. And we can see that recently with Columbus statues. This one actually is in Providence, Rhode Island, in the neighborhood I grew up in, South Providence. And this statue of Columbus has been regularly defaced over the last few years, and they actually moved it recently. To stop celebrating genocide, and it's doused in red paint meant to simulate blood. So obviously a lot of people, including many of you, I assume, think that Columbus is a monster and we should not be celebrating this person. They think he has blood on his hands. They think he's responsible for genocide. And if you truly believe that, yeah, if you think that Columbus is the equivalent of Hitler, nobody wants a statue of Hitler in their neighborhood, right? Understood. So there's been this process, right, of destroying these statues, monuments, murderer, pretty on the nose, renaming Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day, a little less extreme maybe than burning something, but it's the same idea, right? Erase it, change it. We don't like it. It's offensive. It should not be honored. He was a monster, not a hero, etc. This is a big debate that's been going on and escalating recently, and you should think about it. Celebrating Columbus honors genocide, terrorism, rape, murder, theft, lies. Wow, that's not good. And if you believe what these people are saying here, and a lot of people do, that's fine. If you believe that Columbus is guilty of genocide, we all agree, whether we agree on that issue or not, if that is true, if Columbus perpetrated a genocide, everyone agrees we should not have a federal holiday for him at the very least, right? But not everybody believes that Columbus is responsible for a genocide, obviously. These people don't believe that. They think Columbus is a hero. They're having a parade on Columbus Day. They're putting kids on replica ships with, and I assume this is New York City. I'm not positive, but major American city, big parade celebrating this person. Here's why this debate is so difficult and so zero sum. You kind of can't be on both sides at the same time. It's really very emotional, very serious for a lot of people. If you agree with this perspective right here, you cannot accept what you see right here. You understand? If you agree with this, how sick is this? Right? You can't you gotta pick one. Because if this is true, these kids might as well be waving swastika flags. You understand? One more example on how incredibly complex this issue is. This is another critique of Columbus. Columbus didn't discover America. Well, yeah, you all know that. Duh. We use that word for lack of a better word in English. Of course, he didn't, you know, there were millions of people here. We understand that. He invaded it. Okay. UW, University of something, I assume, Chicano students. The word Chicano specifically refers to people of Mexican descent. Here's how incredibly complex this is. Do these young Mexican Americans have the right to criticize and condemn Columbus? Of course, 100%. Have fun. Here's how incredibly complex this is. Without Columbus, there's no such thing as Chicano. You understand? Without Columbus, there's no such thing as Mexican as we know it. Without Columbus, there's no such thing as Hispanic. These people condemning Columbus, and they have every right to do it, of course. What language do you think they speak? 99% probability they speak Spanish. What religious tradition do you think they were raised in? 95% chance Catholic. Whose DNA is coursing through their bodies? The DNA of Native Americans, for sure, mixed with Spanish. Spanish-speaking Catholics from Europe. These people culturally, linguistically, biologically would not exist if it were not for Columbus. Does that mean they can condemn him? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means life is very, very complicated. So that is a really interesting debate. If you want to do a current event on that issue, anything revolving around the issue of Columbus, tearing down statues, removing statues, renaming Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, et cetera, et cetera. Really important issue. I'm looking at what we have left, and there's no way I'm going to be able to do all of this in one recording because I have to go pick up my son soon. But let me go back to this topic and give you one more example of this that goes beyond Columbus. A really important thing for you to think about. You think about Columbus specifically, where you land with him on this issue. What standard do we judge him by, et cetera, et cetera. Understand this issue, this debate goes for all historical figures, okay? All of them. Because all historical figures lived before us, duh, by definition, in a time when morals, values, taboos were different, okay? And if we go down this road of everyone who lived before me was an awful, terrible person, okay, where does that end, though? Where's the line? When is it appropriate, if ever, for us to sit in moral judgment of people in the past and claim that we're better than them? That can be a very tricky thing, okay? Sometimes you just need to have the moral clarity to condemn someone, right? Hitler was evil. All right, that's a layup. That's not complicated. But sometimes you got to be real careful. Where's the line? Okay. Was Columbus associated with slavery? Yeah, he was. You know who else was? Everybody else. What do we do with that? Do we condemn everybody from every civilization for all time that had anything to do with slavery? Because that's almost everybody who ever lived in one way or another, right? Where's the line? Let me give you an example of someone you probably admire. The only other person other than Columbus to have a federal holiday named after him, right? Martin Luther King. I'm sure most of you look at Martin Luther King as a really upstanding, good, great man, right? Let me ask you a question. Do you think Martin Luther King approved of gay marriage? Our society now, generally, for most people, has evolved to the point where gay marriage is considered fine, appropriate. Even if people don't personally agree with it, they think it should be legal. We've evolved a lot on that issue. Even in my own lifetime, we've evolved light years. There is a consensus now in our society that gay marriage should be legal. Do you think Martin Luther King would have agreed with that? Spoiler alert, he would not have agreed with that. Martin Luther King would not have been in favor of gay marriage, okay? Does that mean we condemn him as an awful, terrible person and burn his statues and rename his holiday? Or do we say, look, we've changed on that issue. We personally now we're fine with gay marriage, but we're not going to condemn Dr. King because look, he's from the Southern Baptist tradition from the 1940s and 50s. Like that just wasn't a thing back then, right? Do we have the grace to give him a pass on that? And this is the question for everyone who came before us. The really fascinating issue. Let me add one more wrinkle in it. This goes looking backwards and it goes looking forwards. Let me tell you what I mean by that. If you think it's okay to condemn every person that lived before you that had different beliefs than you do, your grandchildren will condemn you. There is something that you do that you believe in that you think is good or appropriate. I guarantee you, something that you think is okay that 80 years from now, your grandchildren are going to have a different opinion on. And are you comfortable with the idea that your unborn grandchildren will look back and condemn you and say, oh man, my grandma or grandpa, they were an awful, terrible bigot because they didn't believe in X, Y, and Z? Interesting question, right? And very, very, very tricky stuff to think about, but important. When, if ever, is it appropriate to condemn people that lived before us? And where is the line? Because if there is no line, all of our grandchildren will condemn us. All right, so there's a lot more to go, but like I said, I got to go pick up my son in a few minutes, so I'm not going to be able to add it all now. I hope to wrap up this first unit with one more session, and until then, be good, stay safe, see you soon.